My name is Devon Ashworth. I'm 36 and I'm a senior accountant at a mid-sized manufacturing firm outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which means I've spent over a decade making sure ledgers reconcile down to the last cent. Because in my line of work, an unexplained gap in a balance sheet is never actually unexplained. It's just undiscovered. Accused by my own sister of single-handedly keeping our family's restaurant afloat during its hardest year, while I did nothing, I sat in a back booth of that same restaurant 3 weeks ago, during its 20th anniversary celebration, listening to the outside bookkeeper my sister had hired read our deposit history out loud from a laptop, entirely unprompted. I'm the reason this place is still standing, my sister, Vanessa, had said, tapping her wine glass for attention in front of nearly 40 guests. Devon wasn't around when it mattered. I carried this restaurant by myself. If you're watching this, comment where you're from and what time it is right now for you, and hit subscribe, because this story's worth staying for. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Our parents, Gregory and Michelle Ashworth, opened Ashworth's Table 20 years ago, a modest Italian-American restaurant in a working-class neighborhood outside Pittsburgh, a business that became something close to a second home for our whole family growing up. When our father passed 6 years ago and our mother's health made it impossible for her to keep running the place day to day, my sister Vanessa, who'd always been the more outwardly passionate one about the restaurant, stepped in as general manager, learning the operational side quickly and genuinely earning the staff's respect within her first year. Growing up, the restaurant functioned almost like a fifth member of our family. Vanessa and I both bussed tables there as teenagers, did our homework in the back booth after school, learned to fold napkins before we learned long division. Our father, a former line cook who'd worked his way up through several kitchens before finally opening his own place at 38, treated the restaurant less like a business and more like an extension of the family itself, insisting on knowing every regular customer's name and never missing a staff member's birthday. When he passed, the idea of losing the restaurant too, on top of losing him, felt to all of us like something closer to unthinkable. 3 years ago, a combination of rising supply costs, a lease renegotiation that came in far higher than expected, and a rough stretch following a regional economic downturn pushed the restaurant to the edge of closing, a crisis Vanessa handled publicly and visibly, negotiating with vendors, restructuring the menu to protect margins, and personally working nearly every shift for months to cut labor costs. Her effort during that period was real, exhausting, and in front of the family, entirely undisputed. What Vanessa didn't fully realize, because I never made a point of telling her directly, was that the restaurant's actual survival that year depended just as much on capital it couldn't have generated through operations alone. I'd spent a decade building a modest but genuinely healthy investment portfolio, and over 14 months during the worst of the crisis, I transferred a total of $47,000 directly into the restaurant's business account in 5 separate deposits, timed specifically around payroll and vendor payment deadlines. Our mother, still technically the majority owner, flagged to me privately when the numbers got tight. I asked our mother, each time, not to broadcast the transfers to Vanessa or the rest of the family, partly because I didn't want Vanessa's very real operational effort to feel undercut by a sibling quietly wiring money from the sidelines, and partly because I genuinely believed the restaurant's own books, reconciled by whichever bookkeeper eventually handled its accounts, would reflect the truth of what happened regardless of who talked about it socially. Over the following 3 years, as the restaurant stabilized and eventually returned to modest profitability, Vanessa became, in family conversations and in local interviews she occasionally gave to neighborhood papers celebrating the restaurant's resilience, the sole architect of its survival, a narrative that hardened gradually, the way most narratives do when nobody has a reason to check the underlying numbers against it. The specific moment that crystallized into confrontation happened 3 weeks ago, at the restaurant's 20th anniversary celebration, a genuinely joyful evening attended by longtime staff, regular customers, and extended family. Vanessa, tapping her wine glass for a toast partway through the evening, told the room, "I'm the reason this place is still standing." There was a few years back where it was touch and go, and I want to be honest, Devon wasn't around when it mattered. I carried this restaurant by myself, and I'm proud of that. I felt the pull to simply let the moment pass, the way I had for 3 years of quietly not correcting the family's understanding of that crisis year. But Vanessa, wanting the evening's financial summary to feel transparent and celebratory, had asked the restaurant's outside bookkeeper, a meticulous man named Mr. Whitfield who'd handled the books since shortly after the crisis ended, to prepare a short retrospective on the restaurant's 20-year financial arc for the toast, a slide of key figures projected on a screen behind the bar. Mr. Whitfield, reading from his notes with no idea he was contradicting anything, clicked to a slide covering the crisis year specifically. This was actually the most interesting year to reconstruct, he said, mostly to the room in general, because operational revenue alone genuinely wouldn't have covered payroll and vendor obligations that spring. The gap was closed by 5 capital injections totaling $47,000 from an Ashworth family investment account under Devon Ashworth's name, which is honestly the reason there's a 20th anniversary to celebrate at all. The restaurant went quiet in that particular way, as celebration goes quiet when a prepared financial slide accidentally undercuts a toast someone just gave. Vanessa's wine glass lowered slightly, her expression shifting from proud to visibly startled. "I didn't know it was that specific," Vanessa said, her voice tightening. "I knew Mom mentioned some kind of help. I didn't realize it was that." "It was," I said, calm, my voice even, genuinely not wanting to turn my sister's toast at our family restaurant's biggest night into a public correction. "I asked Mom not to make it a big announcement at the time. I didn't want it to take anything away from everything you were actually doing on the ground every single day." Our mother, sitting near the front, spoke up gently. "I told Devon not to make a thing of it back then," she said, because Vanessa was under so much pressure already. "I probably should have told you both to just talk to each other properly once things stabilized." Vanessa's composure cracked slightly, genuine emotion crossing her face, somewhere between embarrassment and something closer to relief. "I've spent 3 years telling this story like I did it entirely on my own," she said quietly. "I think some part of me needed to believe that, because it felt like it was the only way any of it meant something. I want to go back and describe what those 5 transfers actually involved, because I've compressed 14 months into a single dollar figure. The first transfer, the largest at $18,000, went out on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember clearly, because I'd just gotten off the phone with our mother, who was trying and failing to keep the worry out of her voice while describing a payroll gap 2 days out. I moved the money that same evening, liquidating part of a position I'd been holding for years, a decision that felt obvious in the moment despite the real didn't put in my own long-term plans. The remaining 4 transfers followed a similar pattern over the following year, smaller, ranging from $4,000 to $11,000, each one timed around a specific, concrete deadline our mother flagged, rather than sent proactively or on any fixed schedule. I never visited the restaurant more often during that period than I normally did, never picked up a shift, never learned the operational details Vanessa was mastering in real time. My contribution lived entirely in a ledger, invisible to anyone not looking directly at the account. I remember one call from our mother in particular, close to midnight, her voice quiet in the way people get quiet when they're trying not to worry someone unnecessarily, explaining that a produce vendor was threatening to stop deliveries over an outstanding balance unless something arrived by the following afternoon. I transferred the money before I went to bed that night and never mentioned the call to Vanessa, who I later learned had spent that same week negotiating a temporary reduction in her own management salary to help cover exactly that kind of gap. Neither of us aware the other was quietly absorbing pressure from a different direction at the same time. There's a particular kind of loneliness in solving a problem nobody else knows you're solving, even when you've chosen that loneliness deliberately. I didn't resent it while it was happening, mostly because I genuinely believed keeping quiet was protecting Vanessa's sense of ownership over the recovery. Looking back, I think I underestimated how much that same silence eventually cost the accuracy of the story she told herself about that year, and by extension, the story she told everyone else. I want to be fair to Vanessa in this story, because I don't think her toast came from any deliberate wish to erase what I'd done. I think she genuinely lived that crisis year from the inside, exhausted, physically present for every difficult decision, and the capital that quietly appeared in the account probably felt, to her, like something closer to background noise compared to the visible, grinding work she was doing every single shift. She wasn't lying about carrying the restaurant. She was just describing the only part of the survival she'd actually witnessed happening. The anniversary celebration continued, more subdued from Vanessa for a portion of the evening. Though the mood recovered by dessert, old regulars sharing stories about our father, staff members who'd been there since the beginning getting recognized individually. Vanessa found me near the kitchen doors later, apron still on out of habit, even though she hadn't worked a shift in years, and apologized properly, admitting she never actually sat down and looked at the crisis year's full financial picture, because doing so had never felt necessary once the restaurant stabilized and the story of how it survived had already settled into place. I want to be honest that money was never really the reason I stayed quiet about those transfers for 3 years. I grew up watching our father run that restaurant with a specific kind of pride that had nothing to do with who got credit for what. A belief that the business itself, staying open, keeping people employed, mattered more than any individual person's recognition within it. I think I absorbed that value more literally than I realized, to the point of letting an entirely inaccurate story about my own sister's solo heroism stand uncorrected for 3 years rather than risk diminishing what she'd genuinely earned. Our mother told me, a few days after the anniversary, that she'd wrestled with that same instinct herself the entire time, torn between wanting Vanessa to feel fully capable and independent in front of a family that had always treated her as the more sentimental sibling, and wanting the actual facts of that year preserved somewhere honest in case they ever mattered later. She said watching Mr. Whitfield's slide land in front of 40 guests was, for her, less a moment of embarrassment and more a strange kind of relief. 3 years of carefully managed silence finally settling into something closer to the truth. Ashworth's table is doing better now than it has in over a decade. Profitable, fully staffed. Our mother finally able to step back from even the occasional shift she used to insist on covering. Vanessa runs it well, still. And I don't think that year's capital injections change the fact that her operational instincts are the reason the restaurant thrived once it stabilized rather than merely survived. Regulars who stuck with us through the worst of it still get recognized by name when they walk in, a small tradition our father started that Vanessa has kept alive without ever needing to be reminded to. Vanessa and I talk more openly about the restaurant's finances now, a shift that started that night and has genuinely held since. She's asked me more than once to walk her through exactly what the numbers look like during the worst months, not defensively, but out of what seems like real curiosity about a year she lived through without ever fully seeing. We since set up a standing quarterly review with Mr. Whitfield, the 3 of us going through the books together, a habit that feels less like accounting now and more like the 2 of us finally comparing notes on a year we both survived separately. Here's what I actually learned, sitting in that back booth and listening to a bookkeeper's routine anniversary slide do more to set the record straight than 3 years of quiet restraint ever could on its own. Staying invisible to protect someone else's story doesn't actually protect them from an inaccurate one forever. People can tell a story about who saved something as confidently as they like. Wine glass raised, room full of guests listening. They can't argue with a reconciled ledger, 5 deposits deep, with your name attached to the exact year it mattered most. If this hit close to home, tell me in the comments about a time you stayed quiet to protect someone else's version of events and whether it was worth it. Subscribe if you want to see how these stories keep unfolding. Share it with someone who's ever carried something invisibly so somebody else's effort could shine, and I'll see you in the next one.